On the 4th of June, 1942, the skies above Dutch Harbor, Alaska, erupted in a fury of anti-aircraft fire and diving aircraft. A young Japanese pilot named Petty Officer First Class Tadeyoshi Koga banked his Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero fighter through the smoke-laden air, his engine sputtering from a severed oil line. What neither Koga nor his squadron mates realized in that moment was that this single mechanical failure would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific War and doom thousands of Japanese pilots to fiery deaths in the skies above distant islands they would never have heard of. The Zero had been, until that summer morning, an almost mythical weapon. American pilots whispered about it in ready rooms with a mixture of respect and dread. It could outmaneuver anything the United States Navy put into the air. It could outclimb the vaunted F-4F Wildcat. In the hands of Japan's experienced naval aviators, it had swept American forces from the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and a dozen other battlefields across the Pacific. The kill ratios were staggering, sometimes 10-1 in favor of the Zero. American fighter pilots weren't just being defeated, they were being massacred. Koga's damaged Zero limped away from Dutch Harbor, trailing a thin stream of oil across the gray Aleutian sky. He was heading for the emergency landing site his commanders had designated on Hellcat Island, a desolate patch of volcanic rock and tundra 40 miles east of the American base. His Wingman circled above as he brought the fighter down, gear extended, approaching what appeared to be a flat stretch of ground. But appearances in the Aleutians were fatally deceptive. What looked like solid earth was actually soft, waterlogged tundra spongy marsh covered by a thin layer of vegetation. The Zero's wheels touched down and immediately sank. The fighter's nose pitched forward violently, and Koga's head snapped against the instrument panel with lethal force. His wingman, circling above, saw the Zero flip inverted and assumed their friend would crawl from the wreckage momentarily. They waited and waited. When Koga didn't appear, they flew lower, burning precious fuel, but could see no movement. With their own tanks running dry, they were forced to make an agonizing decision: abandon their comrade and return to their carrier. They would report Koga dead and the Zero destroyed, as per standard protocol. But the Zero wasn't destroyed. It sat upside down in the marsh, remarkably intact, with its dead pilot still strapped inside. Fog rolled in from the Bering Sea, concealing the crash site. Weeks passed, then a month. The Zero remained hidden in the wilderness, gradually settling into the soft ground, preserved by the cold climate like an insect in amber. The Japanese, believing the aircraft had been destroyed, never mounted a recovery mission. The Americans, unaware of its existence, continued to lose pilots and planes at an alarming rate to an enemy fighter they still didn't fully understand. Somewhere in Washington, planners were beginning to contemplate the unthinkable: that air superiority over the Pacific might be permanently lost. On the 10th of July, 1942, a United States Navy PBY Catalina flying boat droned over Akutan Island on a routine patrol. The co-pilot, scanning the monotonous landscape below through binoculars, suddenly sat upright. There, partially concealed by the tundra, but unmistakable in its outline, was an intact Japanese Zero fighter, the most sought-after prize in American military intelligence. The discovery triggered a flurry of encrypted radio messages that reached Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor within hours. Lieutenant William Bill Thies, a Navy salvage expert, received his orders with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He was to take a team to Akutan immediately and recover the Zero by any means necessary. The intelligence value of an intact enemy fighter was incalculable. American engineers had been working from fragments, grainy photographs, and pilot testimony all inadequate for understanding the Zero's true capabilities. Thies knew that if his team could bring back this aircraft, it might save thousands of American lives. It might also change the entire course of the Pacific War. The salvage operation proved to be a logistical nightmare. Akutan Island offered no harbor, no runway, and no level ground suitable for landing even a small transport aircraft. Thies and his 12-man team were deposited by seaplane onto a choppy bay and had to wade ashore through frigid water carrying their tools and equipment. When they finally reached the crash site, they found Koga's body still in the cockpit, perfectly preserved by the cold. They buried him nearby with military honors of in war. There were certain decencies to be observed. The Zero itself presented a puzzle. It was inverted, half buried in mud, but appeared structurally sound. These teams spent days digging around the fuselage, installing support frames, and preparing to flip the fighter upright. The Aleutian weather worked against them, constantly fog, rain, and howling winds that could knock a man off his feet. Supplies had to be ferried in by seaplane, and every piece of equipment that arrived was a minor victory. The men worked 18-hour shifts, sleeping in tents that barely kept out the cold, subsisting on canned rations and coffee that never stayed hot for more than a few minutes. When they finally managed to turn the Zero upright using hand winches and makeshift tripods, Thies allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The fighter sat on its landing gear, battered but complete. The red Hinomaro, the rising sun emblem on its fuselage, seemed to glow even in the weak Aleutian sunlight. Thies walked around it slowly, taking in every detail. The wings were fabric-covered, surprisingly delicate. The cockpit was cramped, designed for smaller pilots. But the lines of the aircraft spoke of speed and agility. This was the machine that had humbled America's Pacific Fleet. The next challenge was transportation. There was no way to fly the Zero off. Akudanthi Island had no runway, and no one on Thies' team was a pilot anyway. Instead, they would have to dismantle it and ship it back to the mainland. Working with wrenches and saws, they carefully removed the wings, detached the engine, and separated the fuselage into manageable sections. Each piece was photographed, measured, and labeled. Every component, from the smallest bolt to the massive Nakajima Sake radial engine, was treated like a holy relic. In a very real sense, they were. By the end of August 1942, the disassembled Zero had made its way from Occotan Island to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. The crated components arrived under armed guard, their contents known only to those with the highest security clearances. Engineers from Grumman Aircraft, Douglas and Vaught, descended on the base like pilgrims to a shrine. They had read the intelligence reports and heard the pilot stories. But now, they would finally see the legendary Zero with their own eyes. Commander Frederick "Fred" Trapnell stood in the hangar, watching his team reassemble the Japanese fighter. Trapnell was the Navy's chief test pilot, a man whose opinions carried weight in Washington and whose reports could make or break aircraft designs. He had flown everything the Navy had and several planes the Navy had wisely rejected, but the Zero represented something entirely new. This wasn't an American aircraft he was evaluating for procurement. This was the enemy's best weapon, and his job was to find its weaknesses. The reassembly took 3 weeks. Japanese engineering, the American technicians discovered, was both ingenious and troubling. The Zero was built with an obsessive focus on weight reduction. Every component had been pared down to the minimum necessary for function. The skin was thinner than American standards would allow. There was no armor plating behind the pilot's seat, so fuel tanks were unprotected, prone to exploding when struck by even a single bullet. The Japanese had sacrificed survivability for performance, a devil's bargain that worked brilliantly when their pilots were winning, but would become catastrophic once the tide turned. On the 24th of September, 1942, Trapnell climbed into the Zero's cockpit for the first time. The Nakajima engine had been restored to working condition, though American mechanics had cursed its complexity. Trapnell ran through his pre-flight checks, studying the Japanese instruments and controls. Everything was labeled in kanji characters that meant nothing to him, but the layout was intuitive enough. Throttle, stick, rudder pedals, the universal language of flight, transcended alphabets and cultures. He taxied onto the runway with the measured caution of a man who knew he might be minutes away from a fiery death. The engine note changed as he advanced the throttle, and the Zero surged forward. The acceleration was breathtaking. The fighter seemed eager to fly, almost impatient with the ground. At 60 knots, Trapnell pulled back on the stick, and the Zero leaped into the California sky as if it weighed nothing at all. He would later write in his report that the takeoff characteristics were phenomenal, the best I have ever experienced. For the next 40 minutes, Trapnell put the Zero through its paces. He climbed to 20,000 feet in what seemed like moments. He rolled, looped, and performed every aerobatic maneuver in his repertoire. The Zero responded instantly to control inputs, light as a feather, maneuverable beyond anything he had encountered. He dove at full power, watching the airspeed indicator climb past 300 knots. The controls remained responsive, the airframe solid. This, he realized with a cold certainty, was why American pilots were dying. In a turning fight, the Zero had no equal. Over the following weeks, Shrapnel flew the Alcatraz Zero more than 24 times, each flight revealing new insights into Japanese fighter tactics and design philosophy. He invited other test pilots to fly it, including Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders and Commander Hugh Winters, gathering multiple perspectives on the aircraft's characteristics. The consensus was unanimous. The Zero was extraordinary in specific flight regimes and dangerously vulnerable in others. According to documentation from the National Naval Aviation Museum archives, these test flights became the foundation for completely rewriting American fighter tactics in the Pacific. The Zero's strengths were obvious. It could outmaneuver any American fighter at speeds below 200 knots. Its rate of climb was exceptional. At low altitudes and slow speeds, engaging a Zero in a dogfight was tantamount to suicide. But Shrapnel discovered something the Japanese pilots themselves might not have fully appreciated. Their fighter had a hard ceiling of exploitable weaknesses that grew more pronounced at high speeds and altitudes. Above 300 knots, Zero's ailerons, the wing surfaces that controlled rolling motion became extraordinarily heavy. The stick required so much force to move that rolling the aircraft quickly became impossible. An American fighter diving away from a Zero at high speed was essentially invulnerable. The Japanese pilots simply couldn't turn fast enough to track the target. Additionally, the Zero's engine lost power rapidly above 20,000 feet. American fighters with supercharged engines could operate effectively at 25 or even 30,000 feet, altitudes where the Zero struggled to even maintain level flight. Shrapnel compiled his findings into a classified report that would revolutionize American fighter doctrine. His tactical recommendations were clear and unambiguous. Never, under any circumstances, attempt to dogfight a Zero at low speeds. Never try to outclimb a Zero in a straight climb. Instead, use speed and altitude to dictate the terms of engagement. Dive on the Zero from above, make a single high-speed pass, and then climb back to altitude using the superior power of American engines. If a Zero got on your tail, don't turn dive straight down at maximum throttle. Pull out at low altitude where the American fighter's stronger construction could handle the stress, and climb back up. The Zero couldn't follow through the high-speed dive without risking structural failure. These tactics, which would come to be called boom and zoom by American pilots, were distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet by the end of 1942. Fighter squadrons conducted intensive training based on Shrapnel's reports. Pilots who had previously tried to turn with Zeros and died were replaced by men who understood that patience and altitude were their greatest weapons. The psychological impact was almost as important as the tactical advantage. American aviators were no longer fighting an invincible enemy. They were fighting an aircraft with known exploitable weaknesses. Meanwhile, in Bethpage, New York, engineers at Grumman Aircraft were working around the clock on a new fighter design. The F-4F Wildcat had served honorably, but it was clearly outclassed by the Zero in most performance categories. Grumman's design team, led by Chief Engineer William Schwendler, had already been developing a larger, more powerful successor. The Alcatraz Zero specifications gave them the precise parameters they needed to finalize their design. On the 26th of June, 1943, the first production, F-6F Hellcat, rolled off the assembly line at Grumman's Bethpage facility. It was a beast compared to the delicate Zero, heavier, more powerful, and built like a flying tank, where the Zero sacrificed protection for maneuverability. The Hellcat was designed around a single principle: bring the pilot home alive. Every lesson from the Ikutan Zero had been incorporated into its design, every weakness of the Japanese fighter exploited in its engineering. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2 800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice the output of the Zero's Nakajima engine. This massive power plant gave the Hellcat a top speed of 375 miles per hour and a climb rate that, while not matching the Zero's at low altitude, remained competitive throughout the flight envelope. More importantly, the double Wasp maintained its power at high altitudes where the Zero's engine gasped for oxygen. A Hellcat pilot could choose to fight at 25,000 feet, knowing his enemy would be struggling just to maintain formation. The Hellcat's construction was robust to the point of being over-engineered by Japanese standards. Armor plating protected the pilot from behind and below. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. When punctured, they automatically sealed the holes, preventing fires that would have destroyed a Zero. The airframe could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying. Pilots would return from missions with holes in their wings large enough to crawl through, yet the Hellcat brought them home. This survivability meant experienced pilots stayed alive to pass their knowledge to the next generation, creating a virtuous cycle of improving tactical proficiency. Grumman's engineers had paid careful attention to Trapnell's reports on the Zero's control forces at high speed. The Hellcat's ailerons remained responsive, even when diving at maximum velocity. A Hellcat pilot could roll quickly at any speed, giving him the ability to change direction rapidly during high-speed engagements. This addressed one of the Zero's most critical weaknesses. In combat, when a Zero tried to turn with a diving Hellcat, the American pilot could simply roll inverted and pull away, using gravity and power to accelerate beyond the Zero's ability to follow. The armament was devastating. While the Zero typically carried two 20mm cannons and two rifle-caliber machine guns, a light weapons package dictated by weight concerns, the Hellcat mounted 650 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings. These weapons, proven in Europe, could destroy an aircraft with a 1-second burst. The 50 caliber rounds could penetrate the Zero's thin skin at ranges beyond half a mile. A Hellcat pilot didn't need to get close for an extended gunnery pass. A single diving attack with accurate fire was usually sufficient to send a Zero tumbling into the ocean in flames. By September 1943, Hellcats were reaching fleet carriers in the Pacific. Squadron commanders who received them understood they had been given a war-winning weapon. Lieutenant Commander Paul Bowie, leading Fighting Squadron 9 aboard the USS Essex, read the tactical doctrine that accompanied his new fighters and recognized it immediately as the product of the Akaton Zero analysis. His pilots trained relentlessly in the boom and zoom tactics, flying practice missions against each other to internalize the maneuvers until they became second nature. The first major combat test came during Operation Galvanic, the assault on the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. American carrier groups launched strikes against Japanese airfields on Tarawa and Macon, knowing they would face Zero squadrons defending the islands. The stage was set for the Hellcat's debut against the fighter it had been specifically designed to defeat. On the 19th of November, 1943, radar operators aboard the USS Lexington detected a large formation of Japanese aircraft approaching from the northwest Zeros and bombers, heading toward the American invasion fleet off Tarawa. The carrier's air operations officer picked up the radio microphone and transmitted the order. Every pilot aboard had been waiting weeks to hear launch fighters. Vector 030, Bandits inbound, Angels 15. Within minutes, 30 Hellcats from multiple squadrons were climbing into the tropical sky, their powerful engines pulling them toward the Japanese formation with a speed that would have been impossible for the old Wildcats. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, already an Ace and Medal of Honor recipient, led the intercept. He and his wingman climbed to 22,000 feet, positioning themselves 3,000 feet above the incoming Japanese strike force. It was exactly the tactical setup Trapnell had prescribed: altitude advantage, high speed, and the initiative. O'Hare rolled inverted and dove, his Hellcat accelerating past 350 knots. Below him, the Japanese formation flew in neat sections, their Zeros arrayed as escorts around the slower bombers. They appeared unaware of the danger plummeting toward them from above. O'Hare lined up a Zero in his gun sight and pressed the trigger. His 650 caliber machine guns converged on the target, and the Zero disintegrated in a flash of fire and debris. He didn't stay to watch it fall. He was already pulling up, climbing back to altitude for another pass. The Zero pilots, finally reacting to the attack, broke formation and turned to engage, but the Hellcats were already gone, climbing away at full power. The pattern repeated itself throughout the engagement. Hellcat pilots dove, fired, and climbed away before the Zeros could bring their superior maneuverability to bear. When Japanese pilots tried to follow the diving Hellcats, they found themselves unable to roll quickly enough at high speed, exactly as Trapnell had predicted. When they tried to climb after the Americans, their engines couldn't maintain the power necessary to catch up. According to the action reports archived at the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Americans shot down 17 Japanese aircraft that day without losing a single Hellcat. The 19-to-1 kill ratio that would become the Hellcat's hallmark was beginning to take shape. Over the following months, the Hellcat squadrons refined their tactics through constant combat. They learned to work in pairs, with one aircraft making the initial attack while the wingman covered high, watching for Japanese fighters trying to intervene. They developed a technique called the Thatch Weave, named after Commander John Thatch, where two Hellcats would fly a crisscrossing pattern that made it almost impossible for a Zero to attack either one without exposing itself to the other. These tactics, combined with the Hellcat's performance advantages, proved devastatingly effective. The Japanese responded by trying to modify their own tactics, but they were hamstrung by the fundamental limitations of the Zero's design. Some pilots attempted to avoid combat at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the Hellcat held too great an advantage. But American carrier groups could simply operate at those altitudes, forcing the Japanese to either abandon their defensive duties or accept combat on American terms. Other Japanese pilots tried to use clouds and weather to close the range before the Hellcats could dive on them. But radar-equipped American fighters increasingly had the ability to find and track their opponents even in poor visibility. By mid-1944, the toll on Japanese naval aviation had become catastrophic. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in Yunnan, engagement that would come to be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot American. Hellcat pilots shot down nearly 300 Japanese aircraft over 2 days. The kill ratio for that battle exceeded 10-1, the entire Japanese air groups being annihilated before they could even reach the American fleet. Japanese carriers returned to their bases with empty flight decks, their squadrons wiped out in a matter of hours. By the autumn of 1944, Japanese naval commanders faced a stark reality. They were running out of pilots faster than training schools could replace them. The mathematics of aerial combat had become a death spiral. Each engagement with American carrier groups cost Japan dozens of aircraft and irreplaceable trained aviators. The Hellcat had become what military historians would later call a force multiplier, a weapon system so effective that it fundamentally altered the balance of power beyond what its mere numbers would suggest. The kill ratios told a story of systematic destruction. Fighting squadrons. 15 aboard the USS Essex achieved a 31-1 kill ratio during their deployment from November 1943 through January 1945. Fighting Squadron 2 claimed 310 confirmed kills against only 4 losses. Individual aces racked up staggering totals. Captain David McCampbell shot down 34 Japanese aircraft, Commander Cecil Harris destroyed 24, and Lieutenant Alexander Vrochu claimed 19. These numbers weren't the result of lucky engagements or poor Japanese piloting. They were the inevitable outcome of superior tactics applied through a superior aircraft. The captured Akutan Zero's contribution to these results cannot be overstated. Without Trapnell's test flights and the tactical doctrine they produced, American pilots would have continued trying to dogfight Zeros at low speeds in altitudes of contest they could not win. The Hellcat, for all its advantages, was not more maneuverable than the Zero in traditional turning fights. But maneuverability became irrelevant when American pilots understood how to avoid situations where it mattered. They fought at high altitudes, in high-speed passes, using tactics specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses Trapnell had discovered. Japanese aviation units adapted as best they could under impossible circumstances. They developed their own boom-on-zoom tactics, training pilots to dive away from pursuing Hellcats rather than turning to fight. They introduced the J-2M Raiden Jack fighter, which had better high-altitude performance than the Zero, and the N-1K George, which could match the Hellcat in many performance categories. But these aircraft arrived too late, and in too few numbers to change the outcome. By 1945, Japan's aircraft production was crippled by strategic bombing, and fuel shortages kept most remaining aircraft grounded. The human cost of Japan's losses was staggering. The Imperial Japanese Navy had begun the war with perhaps the best-trained naval aviators in the world, men who had spent years honing their skills, flying thousands of hours before ever seeing combat. By late 1944, most of these veterans were dead, killed in the skies over the Solomons, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Philippines. Their replacements received increasingly abbreviated training, sometimes as little as 100 hours before being sent into combat. These inexperienced pilots flying inferior aircraft against American veterans in Hellcats stood virtually no chance of survival. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese aviators was profound. Pilots who had once felt invincible in their Zeros now understood they were flying death traps against an enemy who had decoded every advantage their aircraft once possessed. The knowledge that American pilots had flown and analyzed a captured Zero, that every tactical decision they made was informed by intimate understanding of Japanese capabilities, must have been profoundly demoralizing. They were fighting an enemy who knew their secrets, while they remained largely ignorant of American tactical developments. By the time of Japan's surrender in August 1945, the Hellcat had compiled a final record that stunned even the statisticians who calculated such things. Approximately 5,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, compared to fewer than 300 Hellcats lost to all causes, including ground fire and operational accidents. The final kill ratio stood at approximately 19-1, the most lopsided aerial combat record of any fighter in World War II. In the years following the war's end, historians and military analysts would debate which single factor had proven most decisive in the Pacific conflict. Some pointed to American industrial capacity, others to the breaking of Japanese naval codes, still others to the development of the atomic bomb. But among naval aviators, different consensus emerged. The capture and exploitation of the Alcatraz Zero had been one of the war's genuine turning points. A single crashed aircraft, recovered from a desolate Aleutian island, had provided the intelligence necessary to transform the balance of air power in the Pacific. Commander Frederick Trapnell, the test pilot whose flights in the captured Zero had produced the tactical doctrine that saved thousands of American lives, received the Legion of Merit for his work. He would continue testing aircraft for the Navy throughout the war and beyond, eventually reaching the rank of Rear Admiral. In interviews later in his life, he was characteristically modest about his contributions, insisting that any competent test pilot would have identified the same strengths and weaknesses. But those who had flown combat missions against Zeros knew better. The tactical manual Trapnell had written was carried in the cockpit of nearly every Navy fighter pilot in the Pacific, worn from constant reference, annotated with personal observations, and quite literally worth its weight in gold. The Alcatraz Zero itself was eventually destroyed not in combat, but in an accident during a training flight in 1945. The aircraft had been flown extensively for training purposes, allowing American pilots to practice against an actual Zero rather than merely reading about one. During one of these flights, the Zero collided with a training aircraft and was damaged beyond repair. By that point, however, its intelligence value had been thoroughly extracted. The Japanese had introduced newer aircraft variants, and the Americans had acquired additional examples through other captures. Grumman Aircraft Corporation, which built the Hellcat, would eventually produce more than 12,000 examples of the fighter, served aboard every American fast carrier in the Pacific, equipping more than 70 fighter squadrons. After the war, Hellcats continued flying with reserve units and foreign air forces for years, testament to their robust construction and reliable performance. The French Navy flew Hellcats during the First Indochina War. The Uruguayan Air Force operated them into the 1950s. But the aircraft's true legacy was not its longevity. It was the 19-1 kill ratio that had helped break the back of Japanese naval aviation. Petty Officer First Class Tadeyoshi Koga, the Japanese pilot whose fatal crash landing had delivered the Zero into American hands, was never forgotten by those who understood the significance of what had transpired. After the war, American veterans who had flown against Zeros sometimes wondered about the young pilot buried on Alcatraz Island. Had he known in his final moments that he was about to change the course of the war? Almost certainly not. He had simply been a skilled aviator doing his duty, trying to bring his damaged aircraft down safely on unfamiliar terrain. His death would contribute to the defeat of his own country was a cruel irony that he would never know. The broader lesson of the Alcatraz Zero transcended the specifics of one aircraft or one war. It demonstrated the crucial importance of intelligence in modern warfare, the value of understanding not just what your enemy can do, but how and why they do it. Americans didn't need to build a fighter that could outmaneuver the Zero. They needed to build a fighter that made the Zero's maneuverability irrelevant. That insight came directly from Trapnell's analysis of the captured aircraft, and it illustrated a principle that remains valid in military planning to this day. Technological advantage is meaningless without tactical doctrine to exploit it. Today, the story of the Alcatraz Zero is taught at military academies and flight schools as a case study in intelligence, exploitation, and tactical adaptation. The aircraft itself no longer exists except in photographs and reports, but its impact echoes through decades of military aviation development. Modern air forces still emphasize the importance of understanding enemy capabilities, still train their pilots to identify and exploit opponent weaknesses, and still design their aircraft with specific tactical doctrines in mind. In these practices, the ghost of that captured Zero lives on, a reminder that sometimes the most decisive victories are won not by superior force, but by superior knowledge applied with surgical precision.